Ok, grazie. Buonasera ancora. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. Thank you to the Peru Journalism Festival for inviting us, and to our panelists for being here to talk about Afghanistan, and particularly the future of news coverage of Afghanistan and from Afghanistan. My name is Alice Speri. I am a reporter at the Intercept, where I cover foreign policy, particularly US foreign policy. And I am joined today by Malali Bashir, a senior editor at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty's Afghan service. Malali is also the host of a famous TV show about Afghans in the diaspora, and her work primarily focuses on Afghan women's rights. We also have Bilal, I'm going to skip you, Vanessa, and get back to you. We have Bilal Sarwari, a freelance journalist who covered Afghanistan for the BBC for more than a decade, and has worked with more foreign news outlets that I could possibly list here up until the very end, up until after August 15th, when the Taliban returned to power and the former Afghan government now collapsed. And then, last but not least, my own colleague, Vanessa Ghezari, the Intercept national security editor, and a journalist who also spent many years covering Afghanistan, and who wrote a book about a very troubled US Defense Department program that sent anthropologists to Afghanistan to work alongside soldiers. I am so pleased to welcome you all tonight, and particularly pleased to welcome you in Italy, my country. It's really an honor. So I'll ask each of you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work in Afghanistan. But before we start, I just wanted to put a number out there. According to the International Federation of Journalists, more than 300 media outlets have shut down in Afghanistan since August 15, when the Taliban took over. That, of course, is only one of many, many things that changed almost overnight in Afghanistan. But I think it's a really truly staggering loss. On top of that, hundreds of journalists fled Afghanistan. Bilal, you're one of them, and I hope you can tell us more about your journey the last few days in Kabul and your life since then. And those journalists who remain have either stopped working entirely, adapted the ways in which they work, and kind of adapted the things they say to function under censorship, essentially, or tried to do their jobs anyway and faced beatings, detention, torture, threats. And all of this is not to say that working as a journalist in Afghanistan was easy before August 15th. Of course not. And I want to stress that it was much more dangerous for Afghan journalists than for foreign ones. At least 64 journalists were killed in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, the vast majority of them Afghan journalists. And yet, despite those challenges over the last 20 years, there was a truly rich, diverse, vibrant, and independent media community that I would argue was maybe one of the most successful stories out of the US invasion. Not that the US should take any particular credit for it, but it was kind of a success story of the last 20 years. So I hope today we can talk about how that community has been disrupted, what has changed, what the challenges are, but also think about the future and think about what we all collectively, and particularly journalists with foreign media outlets, can do to continue to support our Afghan colleagues, to continue to cover Afghanistan, even as there are many other wars, many other conflicts in the world that kind of claim our attention. And really ensure that we not only try to cover Afghanistan ourselves, but empower our Afghan colleagues, both in Afghanistan and those who left, to continue to tell their stories themselves. And I'd like to start with you, Malali. I mentioned more than 64 journalists were killed in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. Some of them were your colleagues. And so I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about the sacrifices and the challenges you and your colleagues faced, both before and after August 15th.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you for everyone. It's a very good energy here, but we have to, as journalists, state facts. And today we are talking about some figures as well. As Alice mentioned earlier, that there were 62 people had died in the past 10 years. The Brown University's data suggests that in Afghanistan, 72 journalists have died in the past 20 years. Thank you. And IFJ, International Federation of Journalists, put this number at 86 from 2010 to 2021. I want to mention how committed Afghan journalists have been to their work and how they have contributed to a free media and the freedom of speech and the right to know correct and unbiased information in Afghanistan. On April the 30th, 2018, there was a double suicide blast in Kabul. It was targeted at a journalist specifically. 3 of my colleagues died. Actually, 25 people died in this attack, and 9 of them were journalists. And 3 of RFERL's journalists were among them. I want to say their names. Sabaun Kakar, Ibadullah Hananzi, and Maryam Mahram Durrani was among those people who died on that day. When first bomb blast happened, journalists rushed to this area to report on the incident. And then the second blast was targeted specifically on the journalists. And we were in close contact with these journalists and talking on daily basis. So I also want to mention our 4th journalist who was killed in Afghanistan on November 12th, 2020. His name was Ilyas Dai, and he was from Helmand province, which is a very unstable in terms of the security situation. And Ilyas Dai was targeted, killed by a car bomb blast that was planted in his car in front of his house. Dai was reporting on different topics from Taliban's operations in his area to poppy cultivation and what the people of Helmand province wanted from the government and in general. So people called him the voice of Helmand. Dai was working, his last report was actually, I was in contact with him. He sent me this topic that he wants to work on this issue, which was a woman called Nargis, and I still remember this name because it still brings emotions to all of my colleagues and us. Dai said that this woman's house was taken by the Taliban, and they are using her house as a military post against the Afghan military forces. She wouldn't leave the street, and she asks the Taliban to leave her house, and she wouldn't go from there. So we want to talk about this woman and how she was going to fight for her house back. I told Dai that this was a good story and we should go for it and cover it. It was around 1 o'clock, and he told me that he's going to interview her and talk to her more. Next day, around this time, I had to go live on a television and say that Dai has died. This does not even, not only takes physical and toll on all of the journalists, their families, and all of our colleagues in Afghanistan. It's also a mental situation that puts us all through. And I am based in Prague, Czech Republic, but my direct work is within Afghanistan. I have also been traveling back and forth to Afghanistan, reporting from the ground, and very much in contact with all the people over there. So it's like people think that people who are based outside of Afghanistan probably might not be impacted. I'm not claiming that we are impacted similarly as Dai's family or Mr. Sarwari, who had to flee himself. But we are all in this together. And this media family has been impacted, but the commitment still remains. And our colleagues are still enthusiastic in working in that kind of a hostile environment. Dai is one of the examples of many, many hundreds of those people who have sacrificed, who were wounded, and whose families were attacked. Their family members were taken to threaten them, to force them to leave their jobs. And this has happened for like the whole time, and now the media situation has collapsed in Afghanistan. Dai's death, Human Rights Watch pointed towards the Taliban at that time, because the Taliban were consistently and constantly threatening him to not specifically report on their operations in Helmand province. But he still went on with him because he was he chose this path for himself, and he was committed, like all the other journalist colleagues. So this would be my experiences that I would like to share, and we will talk more. Thank you.
Thank you. Bilal and Vanessa, again, I'm going to skip you and come back to you later. But Bilal, you told me that up until August 15th, and in fact, even after August 15th, you were working 20 hours a day with multiple outlets and were so kind of consumed by your work that you hadn't even thought about making a plan and what you would do for yourself and your family. And then a few days later, you ended up making the decision to leave. So can you talk to us a bit about what is it like to cover such an enormous story like the fall of Kabul and the collapse of the former Afghan government at a time when this is your country and your community and your city that's been impacted, your family, and you yourself, of course.
Thank you very much, for having us here, and for everyone for attending. On August the 10th, I went to the northern outskirts of Kabul city, an area called Khair Khana, with a number of my international colleagues. And we wanted to cover, close to 3,000 Afghan civilians, including women and children, who had just been staying at this park, open between two very busy roads. And I remember interviewing this farmer from Kunduz province. He was telling me how he'd lost all his mung bean and all the harvest, that he could only bring a pair of clothes with him. And immediately I got very emotional, and tears started coming down my eyes, because this is exactly what had happened to me as a kid in the 1990s. And I told myself, how could it be that there's this cycle of tragedies coming back and forth for generations? And I'd never forget, doing my piece to camera and being a freelancer, I had to record everything. I had to do something for BBC, for an Urdu outlet, independent Urdu. Coming back to my office, I thought about this quite a lot, about my own family, about our daughter Sola. She was just born a few months before, and I thought, what exactly is going to come out of the war? Will we ever have a ceasefire? And little did I know that in less than a week's time, I would be forced to leave Kabul once more with only one pair of clothes. So Afghanistan, quite tragically, was experiencing some of the most destructive wave of attacks over the last 3 years. Whether you spoke about airstrikes or suicide truck bombs or this army of Taliban suicide attackers blowing themselves up, and the new front line was everywhere. That was the most tricky thing. My name was on 5, 6 different assassination lists, because there was this very big campaign of targeting the most capable Afghans within the media, civil society, female prosecutors, judges. So, I wasn't suicidal, but in my own mind, I knew that it could happen. And this was also the period that we were going through both psychological turbulence and psychological torture as a whole, the country. But we were hoping that we could see an end to the bloodshed, that we could have a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire. No matter how many hats do I wear, no matter how many lives I did for CNN and France 24 and NPR, at the end of the day, I was an Afghan. I was living there, and I wanted my daughter to grow up there. But all of those dreams were shattered. And to be honest with you, every morning when I came out, I was telling Andrew North, my former colleague and good friend, I would look at the houses of the Afghan generals who were my friends, the young guys, and I would know that their wives were there, their kids were there. So I was confident that Kabul would not fall. But on August the 15th, suddenly Kabul fell, and my next door neighbor, who I had never thought of as anything, turned out to be the Taliban intelligence guy. For 3 years, he was living there. So I found myself in a very helpless position. Not only did I have documentation for all members of my family, I was offered a resettlement to Canada a month before that. I thought, okay, what do I do now? This guy knows me, right? So I was stuck, and to be honest with you, when I was taken to the Serena Hotel, thanks to Middlebury College, thanks to ABC and a lot of my friends and colleagues, I became a refugee in my own country. You know, in that hotel, it felt like Hotel Rwanda. Inside, there was music, there was this buffet. Taliban guys were eating like 10, 15 times as if there was like no tomorrow, you know. And we were like so scared. I was genuinely scared because, you know, exactly will they do to you? So quite tragically, you know, I was experiencing, as an Afghan, war once more. And this time, all the responsibility and the weight on my shoulders to tell the world about what was happening wasn't an easy thing. Because I had left as a kid, I had come back as a teenager covering the war, right? I became an accidental journalist through that last 20 years, and I was leaving once more because of war. But to tell you the truth, you know, that interview with Lise Doucet that I had to do before getting to the plane, you know, it was just too sudden, and I couldn't say no to Lise Doucet. You know, she's like a mother figure to all of us. I said to her one thing. I said, our love affair with Afghanistan is a very fatal love affair. One day we will be back. I'm still of the view that one day we will go back to our country. But until we go back, we're not going to give up on the people of Afghanistan. Just because we are forced out of Kabul does not mean that we cannot work on Afghanistan. So we are here. We will continue to tweet. We will continue to share stories. We will continue to write. And we hope that our Western colleagues in the news organizations continue to support that effort and that dream. Thank you.
Thank you. And Vanessa, let's talk about those Western colleagues. When the Taliban arrived in Kabul on August 15th, we at the Intercept covered, among other things, an effort by some foreign media organizations and a lot of individual journalists, actually, to evacuate Afghan colleagues that they had worked with over the years. Some tried really hard, some tried maybe a little less so, some didn't try at all. But I think the question emerged at that time, as it does kind of periodically in the coverage of conflict and as it is emerging again in Ukraine right now, about this power imbalance that exists between foreign journalists covering a conflict and their local colleagues. And I think that moment really underscored the inequities that exist. And it raised a question, I think, about moral responsibility that all of us, foreign journalists covering a conflict, should ask ourselves at all times of the process, but certainly at times like this. And that is, what is our moral obligation? What do we owe our Afghan colleagues, those that we worked closely, directly with, whose work we relied on so heavily, because really a lot of what foreign journalists do in conflict zones wouldn't be possible without their local colleagues. But also, what do we owe the broader media community in Afghanistan that in some ways we also supported, particularly as Americans? And so, yeah, it's kind of like a big question, but what is our moral obligation?
Oh, you already turned it on for me. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you all for coming to this. Yeah, what is an American doing on a panel about the future of Afghan journalism? I wondered as I was invited to be on this panel, which I'm very excited to be on. But here I'm sitting next to two people who have lived this in a way that, I have not and never would be able to. I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of how I came to Afghanistan and what my experience has been there briefly before I answer your question, Alice. There are, as both Bilal and Malali have suggested, there are sort of various chapters of recent Afghan history and also of recent journalism in Afghanistan. So you have to kind of turn the clock way back to get to where I come in. I went to Afghanistan as a young reporter. I left the U.S. On the night of September 10th, thinking that I was going to go freelance in India for a few months. I was, I had just been a reporter for a few years. By the time I, got off my flight, the attacks of 9/11 had happened, and I ended up in South Asia at a time that was just, it was a very lucky time to be a young freelancer with zero contacts and zero knowledge of the region, to land there in the middle of a time when suddenly organizations that had been closing their bureaus in places like India and Pakistan and maybe hadn't had a reporter in Afghanistan for many years were suddenly, just riveted to the region. And so I ended up, what I thought was just going to be a couple months of, going around India doing stories. I ended up spending almost 3 years in the region and pretty quickly going to Afghanistan. I spent most of the fall of 2001 on the Pakistani border and then went to Afghanistan in 2002 and was there for most of the next couple of years. And I met Bilal then, and he was a huge resource for all of us who came. And so, we were in this new wave of journalists. There had been journalists going to Afghanistan, foreign journalists, during the Taliban era, but not so many. And there hadn't been at all a well-developed Afghan media ecosystem in that time. There were no private radio or TV stations in Afghanistan under the Taliban. There was the Taliban's radio, Radio Shariat, and then there were the international services, which a lot of Afghans listened to on portable radios with batteries. So, people were listening to the BBC services and the Voice of America and Radio Liberty, but this whole ecosystem of Afghan journalism basically developed after 2001. And one thing that's been interesting listening to these panels about Afghanistan over the last couple of days is to hear this sort of more complicated than what we usually hear account of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan as both, a terrible act of violence against an entire country in revenge for the activities of a very small number of people who were not Afghan, okay? At the same time, it created a kind of space there that allowed this blossoming for at least some people in Afghanistan, and for some people, particularly in cities, to do things like journalism. So I started working with my first translator when I first landed in Kabul was a 12-year-old boy who spoke excellent English because he had lived in a refugee camp in Pakistan. And he went around with me for the first 2 weeks that I was in the country, and we went up to the Shamali Plain and interviewed refugees who were returning from Pakistan. And after that, I worked with a number of Afghans who had been doctors. They had been students. And, like Bilal, you were a shopkeeper before. I
was a salesman.
A salesman.
Yeah.
These are really just incredibly capable people who saw an opportunity to be part of something that because I'm a journalist, I think is important, which is like being able to tell your own stories about your own country. And actually, we couldn't do our work without these people. So, and most of the people in this room know that, but I think it's really important to say that. I want to talk more as we get further in the panel about what we can do now, what people like me or others here could do now to help Afghan journalists. But in terms of what our moral responsibility is, I mean, when Kabul, when the government collapsed and the Taliban took over, I mean, this was a totally shattering experience for a lot of us who had spent time there for many different reasons. Not because we didn't think the Taliban were a political reality that was at some point going to have a very important role in running the country, but just, we have had responsibility to so many people in Afghanistan over the time of the international involvement there. I think about the people who I interviewed, who I asked them to speak to me with the understanding that their voices would get to people in America, and also with the implication that they would be safe, even if I didn't expressly say that. And I think, of course, about the journalists I worked with, and I did some training of journalists as well, with the notion, as I just said, that I can help these people tell their own stories. And now what happens? Now they can be arrested for that. They can be maybe tortured for that. They can maybe even be killed for that. And as Malali says, and I'll stop here, one thing we should talk about is how that's not actually new. Like, this has been going on for 20 years, and journalists have been in danger for telling these stories for 20 years, and that continues now.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, I did want to follow up with you, Malali, and talk about that. And in your work, you focus on women, Afghan women in particular, and as an Afghan woman, an Afghan female journalist yourself, could you talk a little bit about the challenges and the victories Afghan women made in media over the last 20 years, and what kind of challenges are they're facing now? Those who are still doing that work, there are very few left, but there are some. And what is the landscape for them at a time when obviously the situation has changed so dramatically for all Afghan women?
We do understand that, as you mentioned, that the landscape has changed dramatically for all the women in media in Afghanistan. I would like to bring to your attention that Reporters Without Borders survey says that since August 15, when the Taliban came into power in Afghanistan, more than 6,400 journalists have lost their jobs, and 80% of those people are women journalists. We have been talking with these women who have lost their jobs. They are not only worried about their jobs now, they are worried about their lives and their families' lives, because they have reported to many times to other media outlets in their interviews for the fear of their lives, not telling their names, reporting that they are in hiding somehow because they fear for their lives because of the nature of their work. Other women are still working in the media sectors, but under immense pressure. Inside Kabul, I have talked with some women journalists. They tell me that they are told what kind of stories they can cover and what kind of stories they cannot. So it's an other extra pressure that they are bearing on their shoulders at a time when everything has collapsed for them. The government of Afghanistan, the previous democratic government, is not there anymore. The republic is not there anymore, and the Taliban are in control. There is uncertainty in the future that what is happening. Economy has collapsed, as you can see. People are hungry, and the United Nations is asking the international community for aid and funds to help Afghans not go hungry and survive. So this whole situation shows that how much the Afghan women are under crackdown because of the changes after the August 15, when the Taliban came into power. In their first press conference, Taliban promised that there will be liberties for media, women will have their rights, and everything will be fine. People will be happy under their government. Now we see that the media has been, under immense pressure. People are not allowed to report what they are supposed to report. And media organizations are, shut down. Women in the early days told us from all the provinces, I would like to bring to your attention one example from Kandahar province, which is in the south of the country. We spoke with the women journalists. They said that when they tried to enter their offices in the morning, in the morning of August 16, they were told, okay, you can go back home and we will call you when it's ready to work again. And so they went home and nobody called. After a week, they went back to the doors of their offices and they were turned again and told that, okay, we will call you. And then after a few weeks, in less than a month, most of the media offices were shut down and people were informed that they cannot work anymore. And this particular woman that I'm talking about, she said that she is the only breadwinner of her house. She had this only job to support her family. And now she is supposed to bring a mahram, which is a male family, a male chaperone, so to say, a person who is your husband or a person who is illegal to marry. So you have to bring a male relative with you anywhere if you are going outside of your house. This is the situation that women are facing. Women are complaining that they are not being provided transport to their work when they try to go because they are asked about their male relatives and they have to be with a male relative if they want to go from one place to another. And in some instances, women had to go along with someone, tell them that I can pay for your ticket and time, you just go with me for this, travel with me to this province for collecting information. And we will tell the Taliban that you are my relative. So this is an extra pressure that women are going through, that they have to pay to other people to become their mahram, which is, probably good for some men, but it's like affecting negatively all the women who are trying to report on go to their job and do what they are supposed to do. So it's overall, I think the situation has become bleaker, if you would agree with me. And but media is still committed. They are trying to report from the ground. I can talk on RFERL's behalf. All other media outlets that are working inside Afghanistan are committed similarly to their work and bringing to light whatever is supposed to. And people like Afghans have been, used to all these liberties. They are used to now, for the past 20 years, for having access to this information, even if it was very limited sometimes, because the government officials also had issues with providing facts and figures and access to information. But relatively, the situation has deteriorated immensely. And women specifically are under pressure. They are laid off from their work. They are supposed to be with a male relative if they want to go from one place to another. And then there is nowhere to go for any other job because they have experience in media sector, right? So if they want to apply for these journalists, it's such a heartbreaking story that they have told us. Many journalists said that they are ready to wash people's dishes and sweep people's floors because they need a job. These are women who went to universities. They have degrees in journalism. They have worked for years of their lives to earn the place that they deserved, and now they have to go and find a work in some people's houses to sweep their floors, to earn the money for their own family members, because they are the sole breadwinners of their families.
And Bilal, to build on that, she talked already about some of the challenges, thank you, some of the challenges and some of the ways in which people have adapted, women have adapted to their new reality and, try to continue to do their jobs in some cases. How does that apply to the broader media landscape in Afghanistan? What's left functioning of it? What is it like to operate under the Taliban rule? What kind of reporting is possible? What kind of subverting of the restrictions is possible? And the other side of that, what is your assessment of the Taliban's media strategy and savviness and the ways in which they not only restrict media but also use it? And then just to tack on one more question to that long list of questions, you are now a journalist in exile, and there are many others like you. Is journalism from exile possible? Can you continue to cover Afghanistan? I will.
Look, in Afghanistan, perception is built on consistency. It's not built on evidence. And the Taliban know that very well. That's number one rule in their propaganda machine strategy. And when they were in Qatar, they got quite a lot of education in how to be media savvy. It was a very smart PR operation. Believe me, Western media strategists were flown in, and they really know their stuff. And at times they were more credible than the Afghan government, frankly speaking. That was one. Number two, as I said yesterday, the Taliban are forcefully and jealously guarding and protecting the narrative that is suiting them. And I see the Taliban very arrogantly taunting any other Afghan. It is a country of labels. You guys were with the Westerners, you are like slaves, you are working at the behest of others. This is actually, the Taliban, in my own view, have become lazy legends in their own minds. From morning to evening, this is exactly what they do, which is quite destructive, because this was the disease that officials of the republics had. They lived on social media, which there's a big disconnect, from the reality on the ground, of course. I have been speaking to my colleagues in Kabul and across the provinces. Each time they do a report, the Taliban's intelligence service, GDI, calls them. We have seen beating. We have seen the raid on Tolo TV, where 4 people were picked up because they announced that Taliban had banned the soap operas, which are quite popular. Again, this is something that is important to note. The Taliban have banned music. They've banned all sorts of entertainment. This is Taliban, the Taliban. There's no Taliban 2.0, as some people had suggested to us that they were. So my colleagues, the ones that I speak to, and thanks to smartphones and WhatsApp and Signal and everything, because this stuff didn't exist in 2001 when I was working as a translator and producer for Andrew and many of my other colleagues. We are getting good amount of information, especially the footage and other stuff. But we cannot publish a lot of that, because if we do, then they know who the guy in Abe in these locations are. Last week before I came here, just actually the day I arrived here, I was speaking to a friend of mine in Kabul. He'd done a report on how the Taliban had forcefully imposed this new bizarre rule where women, men cannot go to parks in Kabul. This is like Kabul city. And he was jailed. The Taliban fighters went in West Kabul. There are many TV stations, and they raided the TV station. He told me that armed Taliban guys are sitting inside our newsroom, telling us what exactly to say and what not to say. So this is the reality. Where we can be helpful and we try to step up to the plate is we try to tell the world what exactly is happening. Because my fear is that down the line, the Taliban are seriously debating shutting internet. Because what is the threat to the Taliban anyway? The threat to the Taliban is a young Afghan woman on the streets of Kabul protesting, challenging the Taliban. The threat to the Taliban is women in Bamiyan tearing down posters and saying, you have to allow us to go to school, right? So one thing that the Taliban has actually inflicted on themselves, this fatal blow, is how badly they have been treating the women. despite all the truck bombs and all the killings and everything, we could not convince the world that Taliban were doing this. Everyone was saying Taliban 2.0, Taliban this, you guys are elites, you guys are in Kabul. I mean, fine, we may have been constructive elites, and we had some destructive elites, you know. So that is number one. Number two, I want to say that with the complexities of a country like Afghanistan, with the threat of the Islamic State, with the fact that you have a bumper poppy crop now, with the fact that you've got millions of young children who are vulnerable and Taliban are taking them to these radicalization centers. You know, suddenly Afghan kids of 8 or 9 years age the other day appeared with swords. You know, this is what the West did in the 80s to radicalize us, to bleed the Russians in Afghanistan. So there's a genuine threat to the West, from where I see it, that we continue to keep our eyes on Afghanistan, not off Afghanistan. And for that, you will need us. And we are also going to need you. Realistically speaking, it's a mutually beneficial relationship. But I do worry that if we don't have a constructive engagement on both sides, I will be an Uber driver, some other guy will be doing something else, and then you will be left with no one. And for us, Afghan journalism is not a gift. We have the Afghan media family because we have shed a lot of blood for it, because we have lost a lot of our colleagues. It's not a gift. And I often think of what came out over the last 24 hours. And if this is confirmed, this is a big deal. It's very important that I mention it, which is the Americans carrying out drone strikes inside the former major army base in Bastion, killing between 30 to 36 foreign fighters from North Africa, Bangladesh, Al-Qaeda training center. If this turns out to be true, then this is a major problem, because the Taliban said that they were cutting ties with Al-Qaeda. And we know that in Khanishin district, a month ago, there was an airstrike carried by the Americans. And today, Afghanistan is not home to foreign fighters and jihadis who came in the 80s and they were using faxes and they were writing letters. Today, Afghanistan is home to foreign fighters from all over the world. And you know, I can say this because I come from Kunar province in the east, which has had, you know, the magnet impact of attracting a lot of these guys. There's been a lot of communication by these guys using Telegram and Signal. So for example, you've had Indians from Kerala being arrested. You've had, you know, foreign fighters from other areas, both fighting alongside the Islamic State, but also alongside the Taliban. So there's a genuine interest for European countries, perhaps more, to have that solid coverage, because you guys will find our drugs and our refugees in bigger numbers on your doorsteps. So for us, it is very, very important, as well as Afghans, to be there for the people of Afghanistan. As Malala said, millions of Afghans are facing the risk of mass starvation. Millions of Afghan children are facing that. And you know, I hate to say this and bring myself again, but I grew up in Kabul waiting, you know, for my family to bring a loaf of bread when there was that severe, you know, shortage of food. And again, that's happening. You have people in Kabul literally not being able to get a loaf of bread. So these extreme examples of poverty, these extreme examples of people bringing their sons and daughters, baby sons and daughters, into village mosque and saying, I can't feed them anymore. Or in Herat province, where people are selling their body parts. Or this little town called Zaranj in Nimroz province on the border with Iran, where this, like, literally, you know, it's a little bit like Perugia, but for different reasons, where thousands and thousands of Afghans come there and they want to smuggle themselves to Europe. You know, the smuggling business is picking up. And you know, you don't know who's coming to European streets, because in Afghanistan there's no like process of vetting people, right? What actually these guys bring. And I am in full support of people leaving for the safety of anywhere in the world. So my own ideas, and I discussed this briefly with Vanessa and you guys, and I want to insist that we can help cover Afghanistan. We can also help train the next generation of investigative Afghan reporters, people who have appeared after August 15, and they're better than us because they're tech savvy, they're young, and we need to make sure that Afghan journalism stays alive, because that can be a major resource for all of us, especially in a world where you have common dangers and you have common interests.
Definitely.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And I want to get back to that point, actually. But before we do that, I think you kind of set us up nicely to return to Vanessa and the question of foreign media coverage of Afghanistan. And Vanessa, you're an editor too, and something editors deal with daily is particularly those who are so deeply invested in and care so deeply about Afghanistan is how do we keep even just getting stories about Afghanistan out there at a time when we have multiple conflicts, some new, some that are years old, some which frankly we covered even less than Afghanistan, at a time when stories like starvation and hunger and humanitarian crisis are just not sellable stories. I mean, I hate that word, but really that is how a lot of media does think and operate. And at a time when we're told the news cycle has moved on and people are fatigued, which aren't we all, tired of many things? But I guess my question there is it an inevitability of journalism that we just work in ebbs and flows and we all rush to Afghanistan when the US invades or when there's a surge in troops or when Kabul falls? Can we actually determine audiences' appetite for stories? Do we get to shape what the news cycle is as much as we follow it? And do we, are we doing a disservice when we don't and when we're just so reactive?
Yeah, I think it is to some degree inevitable that we move on to a new story. It's not like we're not going to change that here, like with the 4 people at this table, unfortunately, or even all the people in this room, or even all the people at this festival. And there were great examples about that in the panel that you were on yesterday, and just kind of how transactional and gross that can be. I'm lucky to work at the Intercept, where we've continued to cover the war in Yemen, even though most of the rest of the world, and certainly the U.S. sort of public that consumes media, has either doesn't know there's a war in Yemen, doesn't know that Saudi Arabia is involved, and maybe certainly doesn't know that the U.S. Is involved and is very important in terms of backing both Saudi Arabia and the UAE in Yemen. And so, Ukraine now happened, and it's extremely difficult to get anybody to read about anything except Ukraine, and that will also fall off the news cycle. You've obviously been doing stories, Alice, about Afghanistan. I want to talk a little bit about some structural, systemic things that I think we can do to support Afghan journalism, because I, ultimately think that is where these stories should come from, and it's actually where they do come from. Even because of what I said earlier, even when international reporters, as we're called, foreigners, are there, it's not us primarily who are doing the journalism. We might have an idea, we might want to talk to certain people, but it's really our Afghan colleagues who are helping us put those stories together. They're the ones who know who to talk to. Bilal has helped me dozens of times, and many of my other Afghan friends have helped me to connect to people, to try to figure out how to tell stories, to talk through how are we actually going to do this reporting. So, when the collapse happened, there were sort of 2 ways that journalists in the West immediately thought about to help Afghan journalists. The sort of one that got the most attention was helping people to get out of the country. And so a lot of journalists who had worked in Afghanistan, and of course veterans as well, and others who were invested there, worked very hard to try to get Afghan journalists who they knew out, and Bilal and others, many others who had really great connections and long careers and were established, were able to get out. And they're scattered across the world now. They're in Albania, they're in Spain, some of them are here in Italy, they're in Canada, they're in the United States, they're in Australia, they're all sorts of places. Some of them, as we've read, were even in Ukraine. Maybe they've left, maybe they're still there. So I immediately, I have close friends who were very involved in the evacuation efforts, but I immediately thought about all of the journalists who cannot get out and what is going to happen to them. And so, you know, my initial focus, and with an organization that the Intercept is attached to, one of the first things we did was reach out to Pajwak Afghan News, which is the largest independent news agency in Afghanistan. It's like the Associated Press of Afghanistan. And they're still operating there, and we immediately gave them some money to just keep the lights on and keep being able to pay people who were going to the office. I have a friend who's a woman journalist in Kabul, works for Pajwak, and she's still going to the office. She goes to the office every day at 9. She comes home at 5. You know, yes, the Taliban went in, and I saw the closed-circuit TV footage where the Taliban came in with guns and took their vehicles and said, you know, you can't have security guards at your gate anymore because we're in charge now. And it's very scary. Like, this has not happened. Other things have happened in the last 20 years that have been bad for the press, but that has not happened. And, you know, so they are still working, and some Afghan media organizations are still working. And I think that is actually where we should put our efforts. And so the ideas that I have about that have to do with, and we can talk more about this maybe in the Q&A if it comes up, helping Afghan journalists learn how to pool their resources to be less competitive and more cooperative in how they report, so that the kinds of safety issues that both Bilal and Malali have spoken about are not so severe. That is, you know, there's reporters who are working together to report on a story. If somebody's in trouble with the government, somebody else can go and get the information on their behalf. I'm in favor of trying to set up those kind of structures. I also think Western journalists should be collaborating with Afghans in a sort of pool system to help them get the information. Like, if they can't go and do the interview because it's too sensitive, we should be going and feeding them back the information so that they can tell it to their audiences. And so these are the kinds of things I'm trying to figure out. How can we institute in Afghanistan and really make this work? And I don't think it's happening yet to the degree that I would like it to be happening.
Yeah, thank you. And we do actually have a question from the audience that I think is, you know, a nice follow-up to this conversation. I think everyone on this panel agrees that the priority really should be supporting Afghan journalists in and outside of Afghanistan to continue to do this work. But there is a question about foreign journalists in Afghanistan, and I'm just going to read part of it. But I think someone was at yesterday's panel where we talked about the fact that there are foreign journalists who are still in Afghanistan. And the question is, you know, is this true, and how can one imagine working, what is it like, basically, how can one imagine working for journalists in Afghanistan right now? Are they free to report? Do they get to see crucial things? Or are they only in safe spaces, not going out? And why do the Taliban still allow foreign journalists? What is their benefit? And I know, Bilal, that you have some thoughts about how that might actually be about to change.
You look at me as like the culprit to answer that. I will do
question.
that. Well, the Taliban for sure has started not issuing visas that they used to do for foreign reporters. And that is mainly because they don't see the benefit of allowing a narrative that doesn't, you know, suit them. So I have examples of 5, 6 colleagues who were refused visas in Qatar office. And the Taliban are also in the process of a takeover of Afghan embassies, because you have this crazy and complicated situation where the former Afghan foreign ministry officials are fighting against each other, you know? And to be honest with you, they don't have money. They don't know who to report to, because the president abandoned people, he fled, you know, and everyone else. So that is number one. Number two, I saw some of my colleagues making like visits to provinces more frequently, but that has stopped recently, because now the Taliban, for example, you know, Mullah Yaqub is the son of Mullah Omar, who was the founder of the Taliban and the leader. He's now the defense minister. And he issued an instruction to the Taliban soldiers and army saying you cannot use a smartphone anymore. So Taliban are trying to control their own fighters. And they have been also, like, you know, as I said, under the Republic, the Taliban were more credible than the government, because we could never find the spokesman for the president, the interior minister, no one. You know, an incident would happen and they would be nowhere to be found. These two Taliban guys, Zabiullah Mujahid and Qari Yusuf, and God knows if this was just a label or these were the actual two guys, they were available. In 2 seconds, they would get back to you. Now, those two guys are hiding. You know, they are not like responsive. So the Taliban definitely will have a crackdown against foreign media, Western media. And the stories, to be honest with you, some of our colleagues did. They were, you know, a selfie here with the commander, a selfie there, you know, Taliban are good, which I thought was the other extreme, because that's what we did under the Republic as well, you know. But if you want to challenge the Taliban, if you're the Emma Graham Harrison, or if you're the Stephanie Galinsky in Kabul, and you're writing the stories which they are writing, you just have to go to the Twitter feeds of these Taliban media army of trolls. I call it cyber tribalism, actually, you know. It's ganging up against anyone who says, you know, anything is bad. And the Taliban, you know, have this disease again, like the former officials of the Republic, that Afghanistan is an island of perfection, you know, that everything is fine, which it's not. So I have a fear that very soon we will see that sort of a crackdown, and which is why we need to be prepared for a coverage of Afghanistan where we can report on millions of Afghans facing those risks, because these are just not numbers. You know, like I have to speak to people and they tell me, so-and-so brought a baby daughter to a village mosque, you know, like, how can that happen? How can a tragedy like this emerge in 21st century where families cannot have a loaf of bread, where they can die of hunger, right? That should not be simply accepted anywhere, especially in Afghanistan where billions of dollars were invested and, you know, Western taxpayers' money. I hope I am wrong. I hope I am wrong, but the Taliban are acting very, very arrogantly and very, very strangely, and they are calling us names. Obviously, I'm impacted by that quite a lot, you know, on social media. Whatever tweet I do, I'm prepared to be attacked by Taliban guys. It does not mean that former officials were good, or they were effective, or they were any better than, and we should not make two comparisons, you know, here. But that's what the Taliban are doing.
If either of you want to jump in, otherwise I think we have time for maybe one more question. And well, I'll just ask it, and then feel free to kind of include your parting thoughts since we only have about 3 minutes left. But you know, Vanessa, you already addressed some of this, and Bilal, you just brought up the question of investment in Afghanistan. And I'd like to remind people who may not necessarily know that the US government has spent $837 billion over the last 2 decades going to war in Afghanistan. But on top of it, it also spent about $145 billion to support the former, now collapsed Afghan government, as well as to support civil society organizations, schools, girls' schools, and media outlets. And so my question here is one of, to go back to, you know, the moral obligation we discussed earlier. What is the moral obligation you have when you invest in something? Do you get to just walk away? And if you don't, in a situation like this, when, you know, the half of Afghanistan's population is, you know, facing hunger, when we have U.S. sanctions that are largely contributing to that problem, what is, you know, our broader moral responsibility and obligation as Americans, so that will be for you, but also as media and as the global media community. And Bilal and Malali, to you guys, I really want to ask, what would you like to see happen? What would you like, you know, the community in Perugia here, as well as the broader media community to do for you guys?
Sure. I think this is a very good question. Thank you. For Afghanistan, looking at the media situation currently, I think that we should also look into citizen journalism and how to support that, and how to you know, involve people to tell their own stories instead of us going after them, or any other journalists that are well known and the Taliban will go after them, or any other people, you know, involved in Afghanistan who will go after them and target them. So this is one area I think should be looked at, and the other area is that I think that you know, the international community and all the journalists should support Afghan women journalists so they can continue their jobs. It's okay if they choose not to say their names. If it's okay if they choose not to, air their voice. They can still collect information, and they can still report on issues that are important to Afghanistan or Afghans. So these areas should be looked at. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think that we should all, as journalists, be looking for ways to help Afghans tell their stories and to ask for those stories to be told, and ourselves to look for stories to tell, and then get Afghans involved, if possible, in helping to tell them, whether it's working remotely with people from outside Afghanistan, whether it's working with exiled journalists who can call in, or whether, as you say, I think social media is a reality that the Taliban has to grapple with now. Everybody has a phone in Afghanistan, and they can do a lot with that. I'm, getting WhatsApp voice messages all the time from people there, and these are quite effective for storytelling. So I think there are a lot of ways that we can find going forward to help keep eyes on Afghanistan. It's going to be a dark period now. And so I just would like to, get everybody excited about finding ways to keep watching them.
And Bilal, you have the last word and 2 GMT minutes.
Well, I think you guys need to keep inviting us to Perugia, This is an amazing venue, and I have learned so much as well. We have been also able to look at journalism other than what we knew in that sort of limited context, right? And that I would say. I think one other thing that I'm very interested is the lack of transparency on the part of the Taliban, because since they have taken over, they've got close to $1 billion in revenues. Some left from the previous government that they could not steal and take away, and some that they've been earning. Forget about the money that they earn from the heroin trade, the drug trade. And the Taliban are not paying doctors and teachers as they should be paying, because they're not the insurgency. Now they are the de facto rulers. And instead, what is happening, tragically, the martyrdom seekers brigades and battalions are now official structures within the Interior and Defense Ministry of Taliban. And I think our Western colleagues, as Vanessa rightly said, each time the Taliban say, and freeze the money, each time the Taliban say, do this for us, we need to make sure that we hold them accountable. Because if you don't, in 2 years, 3 years' time, you will have an army of suicide attackers, which will not only stay limited to Afghanistan or to the region. This will eventually, quite tragically, find its way, elsewhere. So we need to make sure we do that. On preserving this generation, on creating spaces within universities where we can go in and have fellowships. Professor is like a big word. I have a lot of respect for professors. I don't think I'm qualified to be one ever. But we can certainly come as visiting fellows, and that is something that we can do as well. I know I'm not asking for pledges, like this does not have to be a pledge. This has to be a practical step. And a lot of our colleagues, believe me, they can offer a lot. Some of them are like world-class reporters and photographers. So you guys will benefit, we will benefit, and that relationship will help everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you to the audience for being here and for everyone watching from home.